Hello, it's Darren from Moonhair Studio here, and today I've got a really special guest. I'm joined by Matthew Bannister, the host of the Folk on Foot podcast, a broadcaster turned manager of radio stations, back to broadcaster and now podcaster. Matthew, how's it all going?
It's going extremely well. Lovely to see you, Darren.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, you've had a quite colourful career. It's certainly gone through some phases. Before you became a podcaster, obviously some people will be will recognise your voice from Radio 4 or even Radio 1 back in the day.
Yes, I mean, I think my career falls into two halves, really. There's a career as a broadcaster and a career as a manager. And I started out as a broadcaster all the way back in the late 1970s on
Mm,
BBC local radio. I presented programs on Capital Radio and Radio 1 Newsbeat. And then I went into management and I ran a London station for the BBC called GLR, where I worked with people like Chris Evans, Chris Morris, Danny Baker, Emma Freud. And then I went to Radio 1 and was responsible for a bit of a repositioning of the network in the 1990s, which was quite
mm,
controversial, but we moved some of the old DJs on and brought in new talent.
yeah.
And I suppose people will argue that at that time we were behind the success of Britpop. And I went on into the senior management of the BBC. Then I came back to broadcasting and did some shows on Radio 5 Live and did a long stint on the World Service doing a show called Outlook. And for the last nearly 20 years, I've been presenting an obituary program on Radio 4 called Last Word, which is on every week. So yes, long and varied is the
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
career.
And it was definitely that last one that you mentioned there, the last word that I first came across you with, and so your voice was already familiar to me when the podcast came along. But how did you come upon the idea of doing this podcast then?
Well, it brings together three things that I'm really passionate about. Folk music, which is something that I got really interested in when I was a teenager in Sheffield. I was born and brought up in Sheffield. And I first heard an album by Fairport Convention called Legion Leaf. And it really set my head on fire. I just thought this is amazing because this is ancient stories of witches and wizards
Mm,
and adultery and violence, but set to contemporary music with electric instruments and particularly the electric violin. And I was learning the fiddle myself at the time, and I got a bit bored with it. And suddenly, when I
mhm.
heard Dave Swarbrick playing electric fiddle on Legion Leaf, I thought, wow, this instrument could be really cool and really versatile.
Yeah.
So I started a little folk band in Sheffield, and we used to play in the open mic nights and the folk clubs around Sheffield and North Derbyshire. And we made our radio debut on Radio Sheffield's Folk Show because we had a little bit of a session on there. So folk music got under my skin very early on. And then walking to being from Sheffield, the Peak District is right on the doorstep. And so
Mm,
my parents used to take me out into the Peak District to walk and, often under sufferance, I have to say, when I was a kid. But somehow that whole experience stayed with me. And I love walking now as well. And then the third part of it all is telling stories in sound. And really, that's what I've done throughout my career. I love making audio and radio, which is beautiful and which tells stories. So all those three things come together in Folk on Foot. But there were a couple of
mm,
things that were a catalyst for it. I went to a
mm.
show at the Edinburgh Festival by Karine Polwart called Wind Resistance. And
Right.
it was a show that she put together, a theatre show, which included her music, but it was about this moor called Fala Moor near her home in Midlothian, just south
Mm,
of Edinburgh. And it was wonderful the way that she, working with a sound artist called Pippa Murphy, made this stage show combining music, sounds from the moor, and she even brought plants from the moor onto the stage.
oh,
But she
right.
also wove in the history of the moor and the fact that there'd been a hospital there where they'd pioneered herbal treatments for sicknesses and things like that, and wove
Mm,
it into her own experiences. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could go for a walk with Karine Polwart on that moor and have
yeah.
her play some of this music on the moor? So that was the first sort of catalyst for it. And then I went to a thing that Sam Lee does. He does an event called Singing with Nightingales, where he takes people into a wood, and in my case, it was in Sussex, in the middle of the night in April. So you start
Yeah.
off around a campfire with about 20 other people, and Sam, as it gets dark, starts to sing songs and tell stories about the nightingale. And then once it's pitch black, about 11:30 at night, you set off on this silent, dark walk. No lights, no talking, through the pitch black towards the birds, and you start to hear the nightingales singing, and of course
Yeah.
they are the only birds singing at that time of night, and they're so focused on singing to draw down their mates who are coming back from Africa, that they will let you get really close up to the bush, and
Mm.
then Sam sits down under the bush and starts to sing with the nightingale. And what an amazing experience that is. And I
Yeah.
kept thinking as I was experiencing it, wouldn't it be great to record this and make a program about it? So those two ideas, Karine on the moor and Sam with the nightingales, were two of the first episodes that we made of Folk on Foot.
And would that have been what, 2018, something like
Back
that?
in 2018,
Yeah.
exactly, yes.
And so from there, you started to find other artists. Was that through the fact that you'd already done these two and people were intrigued to walk, or did you think, I know who walks, let's ask them along?
Well, no, but I mean, basically, I started with a list of people that I really loved their music, and
Mm,
so one of the first was Steve Knightley out of Show of Hands,
yeah.
and he kindly agreed to be the sort of guinea pig for it. And I knew it was going to work when we were recording with him down in Exmouth, because he's a proud Devonian.
Mm,
And he has this amazing song called The Dive about a father and son who go out fishing together, and the son is diving
right.
to get oysters or something from the seabed, and
Mm,
the boat drifts, and he comes back up, and his father's disappeared. And
right.
Steve makes this amazing song, which is about relationships between fathers and sons and about diving. And he took us to sing it on the boat in
Oh,
Exmouth
right.
Harbour, where and we met the guy who it was about, who had been the
Yeah.
diver. And I thought, this is really powerful when you hear a song sung on the spot where it was inspired.
Mm,
There's something extra powerful about that,
mm,
and really moving. So yeah, I just started out with people that I really loved their music. The Young Uns, were one of the first
yeah.
to take part too, and they took us on this extraordinary journey around the historic Hartlepool headland, ending up in a pub where they used to run a folk club, but just stopping off at a museum there. There's a battery there that was part of the defences of the headland, and then going into the ancient church and singing
Mm,
songs inspired by that. And so I basically started by approaching anybody whose music I loved and finding out that a lot of them agreed to do it.
yeah. And there does feel like there's a very open nature to folk musicians. Even when you go along to a folk gig, they're talking to the audience as if they're just down the pub with their mates. You have that connection, don't you? That connection with folk musicians that doesn't always seem to be there with some other genres of music.
Now, I don't think folk musicians want to put themselves above their audience, or separate themselves from their audience, because they understand that the music that they're by and large involved in is everybody's music.
Mm,
It's traditional music that's being passed on from generation to generation. And even I think even if they're writing their own versions of it, they come from that ideology, if you like.
mm,
And the other thing about folk music is that it has a very strong connection to place. It has a very powerful connection to particular places. And so there are different folk traditions in different parts of the United Kingdom and Ireland. And that's what Folk on Foot really capitalizes on. So when
yeah.
you ring a folk musician and say, I want to, go to a landscape that has inspired your music, they regard that as a very obvious and sensible question. I remember Julie Fowlis, the Gaelic singer, when we walked with her on the shores of Loch Ness. She said that, in North Uist, the island where she comes from, she can literally map the landscape by songs.
Mm,
So she can see the songs in the landscape. And she realized that she couldn't do that in the area around Inverness, where she now lives. But she set out to research it, and then she'd created a map of the landscape, which
Yeah.
she showed me, with songs embedded in the landscape from where they, the particular houses or the particular villages or the
Yeah.
particular places that they'd come from. So it's that spirit that we tap into on Folk on Foot, the sense that songs can be embedded into the landscape, and that they're really, and often artists have never performed them in the landscape. They've only
No.
ever performed them on stage or in the upper room of a pub or whatever. So when we ask them to go and do it there, it's a revelation for them too to sing it in the place where it actually came from.
Yeah, and you can almost hear that sort of emotional resonance there because of that fact that they might have written about a stone circle, but they've never actually gone into the stone circle and played the song that they wrote about it. And that's fascinating when you sort of hear that in their voices, really, as they're singing their songs. And of course with Julie Fowlis also there's that connection with language as well.
Yes.
And I was surprised to learn that she wasn't a native speaker, was she? She learnt to
She
speak.
learned Gaelic, yes,
Yeah,
although obviously people around her were native speakers, but she actually
yeah,
would set out to learn the language. And I think, in a way, she's done more than anybody else to promote the
yes,
interests of the Gaelic language around the world. She's been on a Disney film soundtrack.
yeah,
She's made music and toured all over the world singing in Gaelic, which
yeah,
somehow to me is a particularly musical language. I don't know why, but when I hear her sing it, it seems to suit the
yeah,
music so perfectly.
yes,
So
definitely.
she's such a great ambassador for the language, and
Mm,
obviously a wonderful person to talk to because she's thought so carefully about all the issues around it.
yeah. Um, I particularly enjoy sometimes listening to a podcast and then going back and finding the videos of what was actually happening because you get a very intimate feeling with a podcast, but you don't, you're imagining what's happening around you. And one of the ones that I really enjoyed recently was Johnny Kalsi teaching you to play the drum, and
You mean trying to teach me to play the drums? You mean
which it was
he's trying
just
to teach me to play the tabla?
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? So Johnny Kalsi took us to Southall, which is known as Little India. It's the part of London where there are streets full of Indian shops selling fabrics and
mm,
clothing, and particularly of interest to me was wonderful restaurants. And Johnny took us for a meal in this restaurant, which
mm,
was an Indian meal like the like of which I've never had before.
mm,
And of course, he took us into the music shops there and tried to, and I demonstrated just how untalented I am at learning to play the drums. But it was another example of the fact that we're not just interested in rural life. We're not
yeah,
just interested in being out in the lovely fields. Fantastic though that is, but we've also recorded a lot in cities, and going into urban landscapes and finding music that existed there. I remember walking with Jon Wilks in Birmingham,
mm,
and him playing songs that had been performed in those spots, when there was
yes,
a music hall there, or in the 19th century, or whatever,
mm,
was very evocative. And standing by the canal in Birmingham and singing for us
yeah,
and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's cities
yeah.
as well as the rural landscape that makes Folk on Foot so rich.
So I mean, it's interesting that you mention Legion Leaf because this is one of my gateways into folk music.
Yes,
I've got it signed by Simon and Swabs in 1984, my first ever
amazing.
folk club gig. But you did an amazing episode with Richard Thompson. I couldn't help feeling that you'd reverted into a teenage fanboy at that
I
stage.
had, I had, absolutely. Because that first appearance that I made on the radio, playing on the Radio Sheffield Folk Club, we did a cover version of "I Want to See the Bright Lights Tonight" by Richard Thompson when I was, 17.
Mm,
And so I'd been a fan of his for my whole life. And then and I'd been sort of chasing him to appear on Folk on Foot for about a year and a half, and
mm,
sending messages to his manager, and it just didn't work out 'cause he lives half the time in the United States nowadays and half
yeah,
the time over here. But eventually, when we did manage to get an appointment with Richard to go walking, it was astonishing because he was so generous in his time I mean, he did 6 songs for us. Normally, people on the
Mm.
podcast do 4 songs. And he had some ideas about where he wanted to go, but I had some ideas about where I wanted to take him. So I wanted to take him back to his old school. And I don't think he'd been back since he'd left under
Didn't
a
sound
bit
like,
of a cloud when
yes, he
he was
hadn't
17.
really enjoyed his school days, had he?
No, but when he went back, and then the music teacher came out and said, "Oh, would you like to come in and see the music facilities?" So we
Mm.
went in and saw the music facilities, and Richard sang an Everly Brothers song on the steps of the school,
Mm.
being one of the songs that he might have sung when he was a student there.
Yeah.
And of course, I wanted to take him back to the house in Muswell Hill called Fairport,
Mm.
which gave the band its name.
Mm.
And this was a house where I think Simon Nicol and Ashley Hutchings were hanging out. And then Richard came along and joined them, and they used to rehearse with the band in this quite substantial Edwardian house.
Mm.
And we went back there, and we sort of knocked on the door, and the man who owned it opened it, and I said, "Do you mind if Richard plays in your front garden?" And he was like, "Well, I can remember the boys coming here to rehearse because I've lived
Right.
here all my life. So yes, I'd be delighted if he played." So Richard
Mm.
Thompson playing "Meet on the Ledge" in the
Yeah.
garden of the house called Fairport with the sign that is still there behind him
Yeah.
was just, a dream come true for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Those sorts of experiences are amazing, aren't they? And as you say, again, a cityscape rather than out in the landscape.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, he took us to a pub in Covent Garden called the Lamb and Flag. Again, this was about an experience that he had in the 60s, because they used to play, Fairport used to play in Soho and around that area in the 60s, and they used to do 3 half-hour sets in an evening. So there'd be breaks between the sets, and he wandered into this pub called the Lamb and Flag, and there was a man having an altercation with who was obviously a bit drunk, this man having an
mm.
altercation with the landlord and saying, "Don't you know who I am? I'm Joseph Locke." And Richard knew who this was because Joseph Locke was a famous tenor, a
Mm.
famous singer of the time. And they said, "We don't care who you are," and threw him out. So many years later, Richard then wrote this song about that encounter and performed it for us in the Lamb and Flag, where
Yes.
Joseph Locke had been ejected. And that
Yeah.
again is kind of spine tingling when you think about all the history that you're,
Yeah.
the vibrations of history that you're shaking up when that happens.
Yeah. So the podcast came along in 2018, and you were rolling along, a lot of different interviews happening, and then of course everything stopped, and
Yes.
we entered lockdown, and that was absolutely devastating to working musicians at that time. And you sort of stepped up there, didn't you? What did you arrange at that point?
Well, what was interesting was I was doing just as the lockdown happened, we were at King's Place in London doing a series of gigs called Wild Singing, and each night it was a different artist. And so that the first half was me interviewing the artist and showing film that we'd shot while they walked with folk on foot, and the second half was them performing their music.
Mm.
And we were with Martin Simpson, Nancy Kerr, and
Mm.
Eliza Carthy. And I could see the fear in their eyes as they faced up to the idea that their gigging life might come grinding to a halt. And I could
Mm.
see it in the eyes of the staff at the venue as well, because folk musicians don't make much money out of selling you CDs and vinyl and Bandcamp stuff and that kind of thing.
Mm.
Their real source of income is live music, is playing live.
Mm.
And so I began to think about what we could do when we were confined to our homes, and Boris told us that we had to stay at home. And I thought, well, why don't we start an online folk festival? And I'd never done any of this myself,
Mm.
and neither had many of the artists. Nobody had ever filmed themselves before. But I got in touch with a load of artists and I said, could you film a 30-minute set in your front room? And we'll call this the Front Room Festival.
Mm.
And then you send me those 30-minute sets, and I'll do some links in my front room, and we'll put it together into a kind of 9-hour stream on YouTube. and it'll be a festival, and we'll tell people on social media that they need to get into the festival spirit in their lockdown state in their homes, get their shorts on and put their bunting out and get a pint of whatever, and we'll have a celebration of music, even though we can't join up. And I think the charm and obviously the idea of it was to raise some money, both for the artists taking part, but also for a charity called Help Musicians, which had sprung into action incredibly quickly and was offering emergency grants to musicians who could no longer work of just £500, but to tide them over until the government got its act together, or until people sorted themselves out. And so half them, we appealed to the audience to donate whatever they could donate. And half the money we raised went to help musicians, and the other half was divided between all the different artists who took part. And that very first one, which was on Easter Monday, raised £110,000, which was quite astonishing.
Yes.
I was completely blown away. And I think it was because people were incredibly generous, because they were so starved of company and so starved of music. And we'd moved incredibly fast. We did it in like 2 weeks after the lockdown happened. And they could see the plight of the musicians was really dire. And so people were incredibly generous. But it was also the fact that it was a very homespun, handcrafted kind of event. I didn't know how to, I had my partner on the camera filming the links, and then my colleague Owen Ralph was stitching it all together, and the artists, some of them filmed it with their phones the right way up, some of it with the phones the wrong way up. They didn't have sophisticated sound equipment, but that was part of the joy of it. We saw into their homes, we saw that they were living like we were living, and we had an insight into their lives which we wouldn't otherwise have had.
Yes, and that makes you realise that these are just normal people. Their job is slightly different to most people's, but it's a job nonetheless. And they're not living the life of rock stars. They're not in $1 million mansions and
Not
living
folk
it
musicians. Absolutely not. And some of them, like for example, Julian Tidow had a young baby. Sam Lee was singing, filming for us when he woke up his baby.
Yeah.
And we saw the things that other people watching were coping with, having kids in lockdown, and so were these artists, and they were kind of interrupting their performance, but that made it all the more human.
Yeah. And so we came out of that, and then you had the idea that you were going to walk a little further than your normal podcast walks, and decided to walk from the south coast to the east. What was that all about?
I walked from Wickham, the Wickham Festival in Hampshire, to Folk East Festival in Suffolk over 2 weeks. And it's quite a long way. I was doing about 14 miles a day. But the joyous thing about it was that every night musicians came and played in the pub where I was staying, to kind of raise my spirits and keep me going. So it was amazing, really, that, and some people like yourself came along, and, Folk on Foot fans and listeners came along and walked with me, and again, kept my spirits going as I was doing this marathon. And again, it was to raise money for the charity Help Musicians, which continues to do fantastic work in supporting musicians when they get into difficulties, or offering them support with their career when they haven't got enough money to record and that kind of thing. So we raised about £18,000 by doing that big walk, and it was music again that was so sewn into it. It was, and then I was welcomed at Folk East by the wonderful Boss Morris dancing side, and then I went on stage with Magpie Ark, who kind of gave me the welcome of Folk East, and people were incredibly generous in supporting that effort. You can still see the performances from the pubs on our YouTube channel, by the way. They're all still there for free.
We'll put links to the YouTube channel in this video as well, because yes, they're well worth having a look at. And those musicians gave of their time freely, didn't they? Nobody charged for coming along and doing those performances.
Absolutely not. No. And they put up with the fact that I was the sound recordist and my wife Kate was the film person, so
Yeah.
we were doing it on the hoof really. But I think the performances again have a charm of their own because they're informal. They're in
Yeah.
front of small groups of people in small rooms in pubs. So there's a special
Mm.
feeling about them.
And I wonder, did you learn anything from that walk? Because I think, you know, a short walk or even a walk for a whole day is very different to being out for a couple of weeks or longer. And you only have to read, amazing books like The Salt Path to see that walking can actually take you as a person into different places. And I know that sometimes you actually felt that when you were walking on your own, you actually got a lot out of that as well as the times when you had other people around you.
Yes, I mean it was interesting because definitely true, and I liked walking on my own. I've been brought up. A lot of my work has been in journalism, and so I've always been a bit of a news junkie. You know what I mean, wanting to know what the latest news is and so on. But for that period of time, I was really completely uninterested. Do you know what I mean? In what was going on in the world around me, because I was interested in what was going on immediately around me, the landscape around me, the natural world that I was hearing, the
Mm.
bird song, sometimes the teeming rain that was coming down on me. But, there was a wonderful, wonderful day when I was walking through, it was absolutely chucking it down. And I was walking through this field in Hampshire, and two hares just shot up out of the stubble of the field near me
Mm.
and ran down the path, and that was just such a beautiful encounter.
Yeah.
And I was imagining I was heading for a village called Chawton, which is where Jane Austen's house is, and I had
Mm.
this sort of slight fantasy, and I recorded it onto my recorder as I was there about how Jane might be sitting in her house with her friends, maybe doing a little embroidery, maybe
Mm.
drinking a cup of tea, maybe with someone playing the piano. And then the door would burst open, and this bloke in orange waterproofs and wore big boots, muddy boots, soaking to the skin, would come steaming into this genteel parlor. Anyway, so when I got to the Jane Austen house, completely soaking through, I said to them, do you mind if I come in and record a little bit, just to show that I've been here?
Yeah.
And they very kindly said I could. And as I walked into the first room, there were two women playing a duet on the piano.
Oh, wow.
On Jane Austen's piano, and it turned out they were rehearsing for a concert they were giving that evening. But I'd sort of
Mm.
conjured this scene in my mind in the middle of the field, and it came true. So yes, and I think I learned, that I could be very happy in my own company,
Mm.
walking for hour after hour through the countryside, and I didn't need distraction, I didn't need phones, I didn't need screens, I
No.
didn't need radio. I loved being connected in that way to the nature around me.
Yeah. Now, obviously, folk music comes from very different places, different people, and some of it's coming from very urban environments, and the talk of mills and the sort of tragedies that you had down mines. There's all sorts of inspiration, but there also seems to be a strong thread of nature running through a lot of folk music, and in fact, a lot of folk musicians seem to identify with the natural world very heavily. Am I looking at this with my sort of conservation head on in a sort of like rose tinted way, or do you feel that there is something to that?
Oh, there's definitely something to it. I mean, for example, Sam Lee is an activist. Sam Lee is a naturalist and a folk singer and an activist on climate change, and has made no secret of that, and has been very prominent in discussing the threats to the planet, and
Mm.
also, is a prominent figure in the Right to Roam campaign too.
Mm.
And if you think about, we've walked with nature writers like Robert Macfarlane,
Yeah.
who inspired with the artist Jackie Morris, inspired the Lost Words Spell Songs project, and that came out of Jackie and Robert understanding that certain words were being taken out of the children's English dictionary, and they were
Mm.
nature words,
Yeah.
words like acorn and adder and
Otter.
and bird and otter, yeah, bird names, and being replaced by MP3 and bit
Mm.
rate and all sorts of
Yeah.
things like that, and they wanted to start a campaign to make sure that children knew the names of things in nature, because if you don't know the name of something, you can't love it. And so they created this beautiful book called The Lost Words, which has Robert's acrostic poetry and Jackie's gorgeous illustrations. And then that inspired musicians to make an album, or two albums now. Chris Drever, Karine Polwart, Rachel Newton, Julie Fowlis, we mentioned, Sekou Keita, Jim Molyneux, Beth Porter. They all got together and created the Lost Words Spell Songs band, and set some of those poems to music and created some new songs. And we had the great privilege and pleasure of walking with Jackie Morris, the artist, and Beth Porter, the cellist, in the countryside around Jackie's home in Pembrokeshire, and going into her studio to see her paint while Beth played the cello for us. And when you go to one of their live shows, Jackie paints an otter live on stage while the band plays the otter music. And so there's that wonderful connection there between visual art, nature, verbal art, poetry written by Robert Macfarlane, and music. And I think that's been one of the most exciting projects that I've seen in the last 5 or so years.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've been heavily involved with that from the conservation world. The whole project is just so inspiring, and we lose some of ourselves when we lose this language about nature and the environment. And we all knew during lockdown that we felt better if we were able to get outside and into the countryside. If people were in small apartments with no garden or space, it was just very difficult, very isolating and very difficult. And we are all connected in some way to that open space.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean, Folk on Foot is going strong still. It's not creating huge wealth for you. In fact, you subsidize it to a degree, but you're always happy to have support from people. So how can they get involved and help support this podcast?
Well, it is lovely to have support, because it is a not-for-profit. I mean, I never want to make a profit from it, even if it were possible. And, we operate, because it's a very expensive thing to do. To do the things that we do it involves travel, and often with a team of a producer and a filmmaker and me going to Orkney or going to Galway Bay or whatever. That's expensive. And then we invest heavily in the production process. So the editing and mixing of it takes time and energy from people who need to be paid. And we give a small fee to the musicians as well, because we don't think musicians should ever work for nothing. So yes, it is expensive. And if people want to get involved, you can become a Folk on Foot member. You are, Darren, and at the top level, our heroes are people who get access to Folk on Foot on Film, which is this extraordinary archive of song films that we've shot on our travels across the UK and Ireland. And we've been doing it right back from 2018. So there's hundreds of these films in there now, which are unique performances captured, Johnny Flynn playing on the Hackney Marshes, or Karine playing on Fallamore, or just loads and loads of the episodes.
Richard Thompson down some seedy back alley with his guitar case out.
Richard Thompson in Soho, exactly, or indeed Richard Thompson outside Fairport, the house, if you want to see that. So those songs are all there, and if you subscribe to Folk on Foot, and it costs £10 a month, then you get access to that archive, and we're filling it up every time we do a new episode. So we add 4 more films every time we do a new episode of the songs that we've captured there. And also I have a dialogue with the people who are members, and at the sort of medium level you get access to 1 film every time we do an episode, and then at the lowest level you get an ad-free episode of the Folk on Foot. And you can get all that at folkonfoot.com/support us. And if you don't want to make a regular commitment, you can always just buy us a coffee, and you can do that at the same web address, folkonfoot.com/support us.
Well, we'll put links to all of that in the show notes here, so people can have a look. I would thoroughly recommend getting access to the archive of film footage, because it is extraordinary. Even if you only just want to work out how the heck Richard Thompson is playing all those notes with one hand, it's just
exactly
unbelievable. Matthew, thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to me. I hope the podcast continues to grow and grow.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the meantime, I'm just going to enjoy advertising Folk on Foot. You can buy
Oh yes,
merchandise
you've
on the
got the T-shirt.
website as well.
I
Buy the
forgot to mention the
t-shirt.
merch.
Yeah,
You
I
can get
know.
merch as well. It's all available at folkonfoot.com. Have a look at the
So
website.
so do it because it's well worth it. Thank you very
And
much,
Darren,
and
thank you for
yeah,
your support. Thank you.
no problem. And I'll no doubt see you at some gig somewhere else in the future. Bye for now.
Bye.
We've travelled the length and breadth of the UK and Ireland to record episodes of Folk on Foot, and wherever we go, we always film the songs that are performed for us on location. Until now, they've only been available to our heroes, those wonderful people who pay us £10 a month to keep this show on the road. And they've had access to our exclusive archive of Folk on Foot on film videos shot all over our travels. But they've given me permission now to share with you what you're missing if you're not one of those heroes. And I'm going to do that in a series of themed shows. And this one is called Folk on Foot by the Sea. And it'll share with you some of our shore-based experiences. So settle back, listen for the seabirds, feel the tang of the salt on your lips and the wind in your hair as we share all these amazing songs. Well, let's head to the Southwest Coast Path now in Devon and meet up with the Salt Path author, Raina Wynne, and members of the Gig Spanner Big Band. One of the most memorable moments in the episode we recorded with them was when Peter Knight and Hannah Martin got together with Raina on the cliff top to sing a newly written song called Salt Song. While Peter and Hannah played, Raina held the book of lyrics.
There's a sting in the wound and the water it blinds my eyes. There's a thirst in my mouth and the cold earth it tells no lies. We always sat below the salt and the setting sun. We had to walk between the world and the endless horizon. There's a heat to my blood and the covenant it holds is strong. But there's a parched road to walk and the journey might be too long. We always held to these four walls, to our landlocked home. And they said nobody worth their salt would be forced to roam. There is salt in my blood, there is salt in the deep of my veins. There is salt in my thirst, in the sweat of each mile we've gained. There is salt in the earth, in each drop of each tear as I talk. There is salt like a hope in each step of the path we must walk. Though its salt rubbed my wounds, it is salt that has healed them again. Though I ache from the walk, it has eased away my pain. We must have salt to give us thirst and enjoy the drinking. We must have grief to find the path that keeps us walking.
so atmospheric. It was as if those seabirds knew they were listening to beautiful music made by Peter Knight, Hannah Martin, ably assisted by Raina Wynn. Well, now, just a reminder that these song films that you're seeing are just the tip of an enormous iceberg, which is usually exclusively available to those people who subscribe to our Folk on Foot Hero tier at £10 a month. Every penny they give goes back into making more episodes, and there are hundreds, literally hundreds of songs like these in the archive that you get for that £10. So if you'd like to support us and you'd like to get access to that archive, please sign up at folkonfoot.com/support us.